All right. I don't doubt at this point I need to introduce myself, and I rather don't think that I need to give much of an introduction to Jake. Jake's probably been as centrally involved in policy formulation and policy discussion around industrial policy and related things as almost anybody else. He was centrally involved in formulating a concept he called foreign policy for the middle class that was more interventionist than Bob Zoellick would like. He was then centrally involved in a whole range of policies during the Biden administration as national security advisor that had very important structural implications. Jake, let me just begin with an easy one off the subject of what we've been discussing, where I suspect you and I are in 100% agreement. Given everything that's happening in the world and the competition we are facing, can it possibly make sense that events have contrived themselves in a way where Harvard University is going to admit 1/3 as many students in the sciences for the next 2 years as it has in the recent past?
No, it cannot.
That's my view as well. And while there are a lot of things to disagree on, the fact that something like that is happening is some statement that in terms of American efforts that everybody agrees on, there's something that's gone substantially off track.
I did think Bob Zoellick said one right thing in his presentation. No, I'm just kidding.
Only one.
I also think I should just get 30 minutes to, go.
It's really
but
not
but
fair.
what-
You get 30 minutes of him and then you have to go with me.
I get cross-examined. So his point, though, about Vannevar Bush and essentially the tripod of innovation in the United States, basic research funding from the government, universities, and the private sector. And 2 of the 3 legs of that tripod are getting kicked out right now for no reason. This is as big a strategic, economic, and frankly, over the long term, like basic American identity own goal as I can think of. And seeing the impacts of that flow through to who gets admitted to schools, what kind of funding is available, who we're attracting in terms of talent from around the world. I think this is more consequential than specific elements of industrial policy.
I'll just say on that, though, and I don't know exactly the way it was in Bush's time, but my view about the complexity of this was affected when I had a conversation with John Hennessy, the former president of Stanford, who's also on the board of Google. And he pointed out to me that the pure research staff of Google, not the engineers, the research staff of Google was 1/3 larger than the entire Stanford Faculty of Arts and Sciences. And so this notion that things are as addressable with some grants to some universities to hire some professors is more complicated than it probably was in Bush's time. So start by saying, from the perspective of 2025, you were into this stuff for the middle class, and then you were into this stuff for national security. How much do you think we should have an industrial policy if we didn't have any national security problems? And how much is, in your current thinking, is this mostly a national security kind of issue?
Well, I think that the main driver of why we need to make investments in strategic sectors goes to the basic kind of national security demands on the United States today in a kind of vengeance of geopolitics world that we live in. But, last night you asked a question to Gina about kind of foreign policy for the middle class and semiconductors, and can it possibly be that getting some manufacturing back to the United States really relates to the middle class in any way? And I would just argue that I do think the broader question of supply chain resilience, while at its core is about national security, has a fundamental impact on just working families in America. And we saw that in COVID, both in access to the basic medical implements necessary to deal with the pandemic, but also with respect to the fact that you saw the shutdowns of semiconductor manufacturing facilities in multiple countries that led to the shutdown of auto production facilities in the United States that led to substantial job loss. So I don't want to entirely walk away from the argument that supply chain resilience, number one, and number two, the allocation of capital for clean energy deployment at scale to allow for a clean energy transition that both deals with climate goals without a massive energy disruption that hurts the middle class, that these are things we should care about because they matter for the welfare of working people in the United States. So I think the core rationale when it comes to these strategic investments is a national security rationale, but we should not lose sight of, at the end of the day, whether we're improving the lives of working people in this country as well.
How much is improving the lives of working people really connected to this thing called manufacturing? I would have thought the ability to find drugs or the ability to have great universities or the ability to distribute things with really efficient logistics like Federal Express was probably more important than the ability to produce shirts, or maybe even more important than the ability to produce more than a minimum necessary for national security steel. Do you think it's right really to frame this issue in terms of manufacturing, or would it be better if we started using the word sectoral policy or structural policy rather than the word industrial policy, so that we were kind of open to the fact that other sectors might count, and we were also open to the sector idea that some manufacturing sectors don't count? You're not allowed to only take the first half, that other sectors count too and need their policies, without also, you see what I'm asking?
Yeah. For me, it's most important that we think about where there are fundamental strategic sectors that, absent government intervention, we may lose the capacity to effectively sustain. So I start from a sectoral point of view. But to answer your question, I don't know whether the proposition I'm about to make is correct or incorrect. But the answer, whether it's correct or incorrect, kind of answers your question. In order to be competitive in automaking or semiconductor manufacturing or battery manufacturing, we need to be generally good at manufacturing. And that is to say, you need a broad manufacturing base in which that is diversified, that produces a lot of different forms of expertise that can be translatable across everything from, say, jet engines to high-end microchips. And I'm just not sure what the answer to that question is. Other people may have a view on that. But can you just focus on a few sectors and say, we're going to be good at these and we don't really care about the overall base? Or do you need a broad base of manufacturing and all of the talent, know-how, capacity, industry that goes along with that in order to sustain what you need in the strategic sectors? I have a bias that you probably do, but I don't know. I don't know the answer to that.
Here's a thought I've had in the last while I've been thinking about this. Which I'd be interested in whether you thought it had any validity. Germany is a country that had as a really important premise of its economic policy the centrality of manufacturing. That concept and that way of doing things, it seems to me, was looking better 5 years ago than it's looking today. And the idea that general goodness and capacity in manufacturing sets you up to move forward to the next stage of things, it seems to me has to be at least a little bit discredited by the lack of success of the German economy in recent years and in prospect over the next few years. Is that fair?
Well, why is that? It's in part because in all these other areas, and I love the question, just Europe question mark that we had in the earlier panel. It's a fair question, but what are they missing? They're missing everything in a lot of these value-added high-tech sectors. They're missing software, cloud, AI, et cetera. And so the question is the problem that they bet on manufacturing, and if they had just put it, that was a mistake because they weren't doing these other things, or do you need both? China has both at this point. So for the United States, let me just take two examples, robotics and drones. If the United States doesn't have a broad-based capacity to manufacture robotics at scale and drones at scale, I think we got huge military problems. Let me just start there. Our ability to fight the wars of the future will be badly imperiled. But I also think we're going to get into an innovation cycle where China's going to eat our lunch at what are effectively the physical applications of artificial intelligence. Now, what does it take to sustain a broad-based manufacturing capability in those two areas? Can you just say, let's turn that on when we need it? Or do you need an ecosystem of manufacturing that exists so that it can kind of, rise up as necessary as the technology moves along? Right now, the thing that worries me most, we didn't hear about it as much in the previous panel, when it comes to the question of diffusion of AI, is not just the diffusion of applications in enterprise or in, I think someone referred to PowerPoint making, but actually in industry, in robotics. And there, when I think about the relative capacity of China versus the United States sitting here today, I think China's well ahead of us. And I think that goes to just basic industrial capacity. And if the United States wants to turn on, right now, tomorrow, if I said, hey, we got to go fight a war, and I need what Ukraine is projected to produce next year, which is 1 million drones a month. They're going to produce 1 million drones a month. Could the United States do that next year? No way. Couldn't do it. I don't know how many years it would take, but we couldn't do it next year. And so I'm getting a little far afield of your Germany question, but I have an intuition that in order to get to a comfort, both in terms of our national security and our long-term economic competitiveness, you need a vibrant manufacturing ecosystem, and you need a vibrant ecosystem in innovation at the cutting edge of biotech and software and artificial intelligence, large language models and so forth. And that the story of Germany is really not, oh, wow, they did a lot of manufacturing and that was stupid. It was that they did not have the other arm built out in the way that they needed to. And also, they have an energy problem, which is massive, which Dan referred to in terms of our own capacity. And that worries me quite a bit as a rate limit on our ability to do the diffusion necessary in AI. The energy picture, the energy story, Germany basically made itself entirely dependent on cheap Russian gas. When that turned off, it was like, okay, that's a huge problem for them.
So part of why we do these things and have these conferences in universities is to point up questions that we don't have adequate answers to. And I don't think either of us is highly confident on the question of the manufacturing scale, and we have different instincts. I think it's probably fair to say that the fact that Germany's high manufacturing competence wasn't enabling of it to do much in drones or robots. Put it this way, if they had used their competence to do drones and robots or to partner with China to do drones and robots. If they'd done anything, you would have been citing that as a big example
okay, so let me
of
do
why
that.
manufacturing competence was good.
I'm going to cite one example in each case, and I think it's a cautionary tale about policy choices Germany made. In drones, there's a company called Helsing, probably the most innovative military drone company in Europe, on par with the most innovative military drone companies in the United States. It has been starved of resources. Why? Until about a year ago, Germany didn't spend money on defense. That's changing, and now Helsing's about to get a pile of money dumped into it, and I think you're going to see their capacity in drone production take off in the next few years because of choices they've made just in the last year about expanding their envelope. On robotics.
Wait, if that was so great, why didn't we spend money on their drones? I mean, why does it require Germany spending money to have there be a German drone industry? Why maybe we should have friend-shored into their drone industry?
You know, we've only spent money in substantial dollars. The United States has only spent money on one other country's defense industrial base in modern memory, and it's Ukraine. We basically put the money in to build that in a time of war. Otherwise, the U.S. spends on U.S. defense manufacturers. We don't spend on foreign defense manufacturers. We compete with them, and we try to get people to buy our stuff and not their stuff. And
isn't that
I'm not saying,
isn't that actually a good example of something that's probably kind of dumb,
maybe,
and that you just illustrated, that comes from this industrial policy mindset that I'm just taking what you said, that we decided we were going to spend our military on our producers, and that was going to make our producers strong, and they were going to be able to go down learning curves, and then they were going to be able to export to other people, and we kind of ran it that way. Maybe if we had run much more of a friend-shoring strategy, maybe we'd actually be more secure, have been able to get more bang for less buck, have been able to enjoy more competition, spurring innovation. And so maybe the approach that we've taken to defense stands as a kind of cautionary tale in favor of Bob Zelek's views.
So what I would say, well, first of all, I mean, this has been true for decades, including through, you know,
I'm not beating up on the Biden.
The halcyon days that Bob was talking about.
I'm not beating up on the Biden administration. I'm saying, but maybe maybe there's a lesson to learn from but it's interesting because the defense sector is the sector that's kind of most like, being unfair, but not completely unfair, it's kind of most like what you guys want to turn the semiconductor industry into.
Well, no, because what I expect will actually happen now in the defense sector, since you're going to see basically over the next 5 years on the order of, say, $700–800 billion of spend in Europe, incremental increase. I actually think you are now going to see, because they're getting serious about spending on their own defense, a much greater degree of what you would call friend-shoring than was true at a time when the United States defense budget was basically carrying the entire load. That doesn't mean that at the end of the day, a friend-shoring strategy wouldn't have been smart a while back, but when other countries are prepared to put skin in the game, we do co-development and we do co-ventures. So we developed the NASAM with Norway because they put in half the money, we put in half the money, that kind of thing. I think a big part of the reason why you've had this dramatic imbalance has been because the US has been carrying just such an overwhelming lion's share of the actual defense investment. The other point I would make just on Helsing is we weren't spending the money on drones in the United States. So it wasn't even a question of drones in the US versus drones in Germany. It just, we were buying other things. We have learned a lot in the last 3 years. And by the way, it was US dollars into the Ukrainian drone industry that has got it innovating in the way that it is. But basically, I agree with you. I think a friend-shoring strategy in the defense industrial base would be smart for the US. I expect that actually will be the direction of travel, in part because you're seeing these dramatic increases in spending. Then on robotics.
You think the Trump administration, you think, I have no idea, you think the Trump administration will allow, and you think the Europeans will allow, You don't think the Europeans, when they're ramping up their defense spending, will want to buy it all from European producers? I mean, I think it feels to me like if you're interested in industrial policy, it feels like what I'm realizing in this conversation is it sort of feels like how this works between the good guys on defense and how much we think of it as one world, one free world of defense spending versus several silos of defense spending is probably a really important issue for manufacturing capacity, ability to compete, a bunch of this kind of innovation.
Oh, I think it's going to become a central question because what are the Europeans saying right now? They're saying, hey, if the United States doesn't like us for some reason and we need to defend ourselves, they can just hit the kill switch on the F-35 and it'll be dead on the runway. So we have to stop sourcing F-35s and start building our own 5th or 6th generation fighter in Europe. That's what the Europeans are saying. Now, what the Americans are saying is, you just agreed in one of these crazy trade deals to give us several $100 billion of investment in the United States, of which defense is one area, so you have to buy our equipment. And I think the way this is going to end up getting sorted over time is through more co-production, co-investment, co-development, where American defense firms are going to create a kind of global face to a greater extent than they have before. That'd be my prediction. And I don't think the Trump administration will love that, but I think they'll find some negotiated middle where they're getting European investment into the US defense industrial base, but also allowing quite a bit of this joint venture. That could end up working out okay if it goes the right way. So, but to your question of what is the right degree of thinking about an integrated transatlantic or trans-Pacific defense industrial base, I think this is an open question today to the extent it really hasn't been pre-Ukraine and pre-dramatic run-ups in European defense spending. And for that matter, by the way, Japan has now committed to 2%, is headed towards 2.5, and is radically overhauling their entire defense doctrine. So it's going to be a very live question in terms of how you integrate the US and Japanese defense industrial bases going forward as well.
You were going to say something about robotics.
Yeah, so Germany was a leader in robotics, is a leader in robotics in many important respects, but they have allowed China actually to buy some of their biggest and most capable robotics firms. So that at least one of the market leaders is now basically a fully Chinese-owned firm. And so I would say that is an area still, though, where if the US wants to compete effectively in robotics, it's going to have to be a story that's not just US, but also Japan, Korea, and Germany. But we're going to have to deal with the fact that the robotics industry in all three of those countries has been, is extremely China exposed because China has seen this is where the future is going and we need to do something about it. And we, the United States, really have not, despite the fact that on the innovation side of it, the US and China are both doing very well. Like we just, in terms of pure breakthroughs on the future of robotics, the US has some of the best minds in the world, the best innovations in the world, but we got to be able to build, I think, or at least we need an allied ecosystem that can build.
An allied ecosystem. An allied ecosystem that can build seems more compelling than our being than just us being able to build. China. What's our objective? Is our objective to coexist successfully and securely? Or is our objective to be in the lead with disproportionate leverage and the ability to exert leverage by threatening them with lack of access to our technologies? Are we trying to win? Are we trying to coexist? Are we trying, I would say in the Cold War, you may not agree with this interpretation, but I would kind of say we were trying to coexist until we won. That is, we weren't really trying to win, but we were trying to coexist, and then everybody would watch, and our system would be looking so much better than their system that their system would fall of its own weight. But that most of the time it was not our strategy to win by having heavy leverage over them. What's your vision for what we're trying to do with respect to China? And what do you think China thinks the American vision is?
So just to pick up on your point about the Cold War, when George Kennan wrote his long telegram, his basic thesis was that the Soviet Union, really Russia within the Soviet Union, contained within it the seeds of its own destruction. And the whole strategy of containment was essentially to contain Soviet power until that day came when the Soviet Union collapsed. Okay. Now, over the course of the Cold War, I think we shifted a little bit from the pure Kennan containment theory to something that looked more like managed competition, and I'll come to that, more like détente and coexistence. But fundamentally, that was the thesis. I do not believe that thesis applies with respect to China. I don't believe that a strategy premised on the ultimate collapse of China is a sound strategy. That puts me outside the camp of, say, a Matt Pottinger or Mike Gallagher, some of the other China hawks in DC, who would say, ultimately, the strategy has to be the end of the CCP, and we must work for that. I believe that the US and China aren't going anywhere. We're going to have to learn to live alongside one another as major powers, and that has to be a fundamental dimension of US-China strategy. At the same time, I believe we are in an intense competition in which China is seeking to surpass the United States as the world's leading economic, technological, military, and diplomatic power. I think that is Xi Jinping's objective and what he would like to see happen over time. And I don't say that as that some kind of horrible, nefarious thing. The United States and China are two big, ambitious, dynamic countries with just a lot of laws of physics reasons to think they both want to be in the lead in all of these dimensions. So I guess I'd put the question back to you. If the choice was we could be ahead with greater capacity, influence to defend our interests, shape the world, and hold China at risk, or we could be equal, or we could be behind, what would you prefer? Personally, I prefer being ahead, but that's just where I am. Now, does that mean I think win is the right answer? No. I think this is a competition without necessarily an endpoint. It's an ongoing competition where I would like to see the US gain as much advantage as possible while ensuring terms of effective coexistence. And that makes for a super complicated dynamic. It's essentially competing vigorously while managing that competition so that it doesn't turn into conflict. And can we sustain that over the long term? I can't say. Do I believe that we had a formula in the Biden administration to both take robust competitive actions and engage in robust diplomacy to manage the relationship? I think we did have a formula that is workable, that can serve our interests, but also serve the broader kind of cause of global stability. And that's how we tried to approach it.
I would rather us win than us tie, and I would rather us tie than us lose. So let me reassure you on that point. But I would worry that excessive eagerness to win could elicit responses and extensive competition that could be threatening and dangerous.
Yes.
So I like the analogy's flawed in 100 ways, but I like to use the analogy of nuclear competition. There were various phases of it, but for most of the Cold War, the idea was that we did not try to make ourselves invulnerable to attack. We tried to make ourselves possessed of a highly confident deterrent. And we thought it was fine for others to be able to deter us, because if they didn't feel they could deter us, they would likely be very nervous. And so people used phrases like the balance of terror to maintain stability. So the question is, how should we think about this with respect to resilience? I would argue, or at least I'm not sure that I know what I think, but I would entertain the notion that the discussion in this room has tended to presume that if they could withhold rare earths in a way that would be very damaging to our economy, that was bad. And we need to make it so that's not the case. Maybe that's right. But an alternative view would be that, yes, they may have some capacity to damage our economy, and probably it's going to be impossible to organize the world so they couldn't damage our economy. And it's probably going to be impossible to organize the world so that we couldn't damage their economy. But it's in neither side's interest to start that conflict. But if either side started to feel that the other side was invulnerable, that would be really scary. And so when China used rare earths last week, was that better thought of as they've attacked us and we need to be invulnerable so they can't attack us? Or was it better thought of as we were attacking them, 100% tariffs and all that, and they didn't like it, and so they responded with a threat? And so how should one think about this question of vulnerability? Is the right answer complete separation? Neither side is vulnerable to the other? Is the right answer some kind of symmetric vulnerability? Is there any risk that the pursuit of invulnerability will start looking a little bit like the pursuit of first strike capability with the associated damage? How do you think about that?
So first, my biggest problem with the nuclear analogy in this case is that because of mutually assured destruction, nuclear weapons were never used, and that was the whole point, okay? These tools have already been used, okay? China used rare earths against Japan in 2010. We use financial sanctions against countries all over the world. Economic statecraft tools are used on a daily basis in international affairs. So thinking about this is let's create the unthinkable and then make sure it never happens just does not apply in a circumstance like this. Secondly, while I acknowledge that China views its reaction as responsive, and this is if you take off all the controls and tariffs, we'll take off the rare earths in this case, what it's also showing is if it wants to produce some outcome relative to Taiwan or relative to the Houston Rockets manager posting some tweet as he did a few years ago, and they want to turn off rare earths to America until that guy gets put in jail. They've now shown not just the capacity, but the will to deploy this tool. So I don't think it's as simple as being like, well, let's take off the controls and then we can be satisfied that we're no longer really vulnerable because we can count on China never to use this aggressively. Of course we can't count on that any more than they can count on us not to use it more aggressively. So then the last disanalogy in my view with the nuclear is in the nuclear case, we couldn't do a whole lot about the Soviet Union having a lot of nuclear weapons. We couldn't go remove them from the silos in, Murmansk. We can do something about rare earth production so that it's not 100%, magnet production, so it's 100% concentrated in China. And we can do it through relatively modest interventions. like small amounts of money and small amounts of market impulse and demand side intervention. So I would argue if we see a vulnerability and it is within our capacity to do something about it, we should do something about it. Now, I think the hardest part of your question, for which I don't have a great answer, is, okay, Jake, so we solved the rare earth thing. Maybe it takes us a little longer, maybe a little shorter, but we solve it. So let me move on to this list of things that they could cut off, each of which would be problematic. You're really going to close that list down to zero.
I mean, that's the problem.
And that's a hard one. I agree.
mean, if I held a gun with 8 bullets at your head, that's bad for you. And if you take away 6 of the bullets, it's only marginally better for you. And that's, I think, the question about resilience
so that,
policy.
I agree. That's a hard thing to answer. I would just say, I don't think the result is, well, just, I would like to reduce the number of bullets, okay? In hopes of eventually getting to 0 bullets if possible. But I would also say it's a bit of a cat and mouse game, because your gun, the better analogy might be your gun has 6 bullets and I see those and I take all 6 out. Then you're going to reach into your pocket and find some more. And then I'm going to try and take those out. I think that is a feature of policy in a world, as someone was referencing earlier, of weaponized interdependence. It is a world we're living in. I think our goal should be to work towards resilience. I don't believe that we should radically distort our economy or expend resources way beyond our capacity to be able to resolve this problem. But my submission would be that for the big vulnerabilities the US has right now, we ought to be able to take care of them in a sustainable and affordable way. Now, someone asked Brian the question earlier, very fairly, you guys saw the rare earths problem for 4 years, why didn't you do something about it? And I could sit here and list for you a set of steps that we took, investments on both the supply side and the demand side. And we really did try to do things, but we're not, like, one muscle the US government has not exercised very well is solving that particular type of problem. And we're seeing this play out in real time with the Trump administration. They did an interesting thing with MP materials. It's not going to really radically accelerate a solution to the problem. I think for this kind of thing, we just got to say, we are determined to fix it. We have a set of tools to fix it. Let's do it. I'm intrigued by the solution you had, which is just go get a buyer to buy a ton of these things and then sell them at a marked up price. That'd be fine. But I feel like it's not good enough to just say, well, they can always find something to threaten us with. So therefore, let's not work towards resilience. Let's see if we can come to some stable equilibrium, because I don't think the nuclear analogy at a fundamental level holds. There are just too many dials to turn and too many ways to do it, even in non-attributable ways, where they just say, as they did for a couple months in the rare earths case, we're sending them to you, don't worry, we are, and then they just don't. A nuclear missile, it's either flying towards you or it's not. And in this other area, I think it's just a much more contingent question.
You'd probably agree with these 2 statements, I would guess. One is, it's kind of an empirical question, in the sense that if you thought there were 25 things like rare earths, you'd probably think that the degree of vulnerability that you're aspiring to was infeasible, and you needed to adjust your thinking some towards living with vulnerability.
Yeah.
And that if I thought there was only one other thing like rare earths, I'd probably be more sympathetic to your view. And so it's a question.
I guess, and I go further than that. It's not just, are there 25 things, but what is the nature of the thing? Because what makes rare earths so interesting is the compressed time to massive impact is pretty interesting. Like, we had weeks, not months, not years, to work through that. That is a very different type of tool, even than our chip controls. So how many of those things, really, not just how many things could they ultimately cut us off and ultimately it'd have a big impact?
No, it's but what fraction, what you're saying is obviously right. Well, the right way to take my thing is, what fraction of our economic vulnerability problem does rare earths represent,
Yeah.
taking account of the qualitative dimensions and the
Yeah.
time dimensions that you're talking about? And if the answer is 60%, the right policy tilts more in your direction.
Yeah.
And if the answer is 7%, it probably tilts more towards figuring out how to live with vulnerability.
Yeah. And I was struck, Bob, on the rare earths point, I think made an offhand comment about how his solution would basically be stockpiling, which I basically took as a robust endorsement of industrial policy from Bob. Because what he's basically saying is you need a massive demand side intervention, like an offtake agreement, to stimulate a market failure, or to deal with the market failure and stimulate alternative demand. So if there's going to be a guaranteed purchaser of a large stockpile of rare earths, we would not have this problem. So I'll endorse Bob's solution.
So just on, I'm not sure I understood everything you just said. I would have said, going back in time, people like me and Bob, I think, would have always thought the SPRO was a good idea. We would have always been sympathetic to the SPRO.
But Larry, this has been a concerted policy of China to force this dependence. So China was not going to sell the United States a SPRO's worth of rare earths. Right. It would have to come from somewhere else.
No, I understand. I do understand that. Really, yeah, I do understand that. My point was that building up stockpiles is a less intrusive in the structure of the economy kind of move than a lot of the other industrial policies.
I mean, what it's essentially saying, though, at the end of the day, is there has to be an allocation of government resources and a market signal sent that we need an alternative supply chain to China for rare earths. It's a different mechanism to get there. I agree with you. It's maybe in a way better than saying we're going to bet on this one company, right? But at the end of the day, this is the kind of solution I'm looking for.
But I'm saying things in part because there are people here who are working and studying on all these things in the same way that we had a discussion yesterday about if you're going to do things like the semiconductor, like chips.
Yeah.
What fraction of the effort should be in the tax credit? You do the thing we like, you get the outcome, you get money. And what fraction of it should be we maneuver and talk and work with the companies and cooperate and try to maximize our leverage? And that's a question. The same thing is true here.
Yeah.
And the SPRO stockpile agreement has more the character of the tax credit.
Yeah.
And the other has more the character of overt
and right. So
policy.
I think the right way to think about this is if you can do the lesser, more neutral intervention and it solves the problem, great. If you can't, you move up the ladder. I would argue on the CHIPS Act that absent the grant piece of it, the counterfactual of just the ITC, you do not get TSMC and Samsung with these plants in the United States. You don't.
Yeah, no, I'm not.
But you're right, I think, in how you would stack it.
How do you think about, this is a thing I've sort of wondered about. I don't know anything much, and you know a lot about some of what you know you can't talk about cybersecurity. It's always kind of been my guess that major countries could, if they really wish to, do a lot of damage to each other. And that cybersecurity complete invulnerability wasn't probably all that feasible aspiration. And so when I think about the bullets in the gun, it's not just the embargo bullets.
Yeah.
It's
other forms,
the non-kinetic bullets.
Yeah.
And if I think about it that way, does the deter, how does that influence this kind of calculus?
I do think it points in the direction of really going for resilience, because we found in the cyber domain that deterrence is also extremely difficult. And it goes to a combination of attribution and also dialed scale, like how the harm manifests. So, China, it's been publicly reported, conducted an operation called Salt Typhoon, which is they basically entered the telecoms infrastructure of every major telecoms provider in America and could basically at will download copies of calls, your calls. So that comes to this happened right at the end of the Biden administration and the Trump administration. What do we do about it? What's our response to that? When you sit down to actually kind of work through what your options are to respond, to raise, to call, whatever, it's extremely challenging. And I think that same deterrence dynamic plays out in the use of economic tools of coercion. And it's what makes this so different from a nuclear or conventional military type of deterrence dynamic. And that is why in cybersecurity, by far the best deterrence is deterrence by denial, that is raising your cybersecurity standards. And actually, I think in the offense-defense balance, there's no reason defense can't do better other than right now the fact that all of America's critical infrastructure is in private sector hands and they don't want to spend the money on cyber defense. And similarly, I would say deterrence by denial is going to be your best strategy when it comes to supply chain resilience. So to the maximum extent you can get deterrence by denial, do it. For what's left, obviously, you're going to have to navigate and manage that. And if you're right that there's just such a long list, that this is just basically a fool's game, and we're going to be constantly chasing our tail, then that is a very hard question that I've begun to think about thanks to you pushing on it. And I don't have a totally
and just to be clear, they interrelate in the sense that it's the sum of the two things that are sort of matter. And I guess one question would, your point about the nuclear threat, there being a nuclear threshold and there not being a economic conflict threshold is right and important. But there is a question about, is the cost of being meaningfully secure 0.1% of GDP each year, in which case your side of it is clearly right and we should get ourselves organized? Or is it 10% of GDP each year?
Yeah.
In which case you would surely
it's an empirical
want to be going in our direction. And I don't think we've got, I don't think we've got a lot of basis at this moment for, I think both of us would probably bet that it was in between those two numbers.
And that's a good
But where in between is not something we would have any great confidence about.
And since I believe that the real competition, the possibility of direct conflict between the US and China is real, that is chiefly a Taiwan story. I think it is not inevitable. I think it can be averted. But what I am certain of is that there will be intense competition in the economic and technological domains. And therefore, my appetite for investment in this space is maybe more robust than yours is, but there is a limit to it. So you're right that it's an empirical question of how to work all this out. And I think that's a good
Well, I'd invest, I would put it slightly differently. I'm probably for investments as much as you are. I'm less sure that it's defensive investment in resilience rather than offensive investment in achieving interdependence, where we have capacities to respond. A different related question where I don't know what you're going to say, so I'm interested. and I suspect others would be interested. When people think about the national
Oh,
security.
by the way, I should say one more thing that we haven't entered into this conversation about bullets in the gun, because of course the analogy is we're both holding guns to each other's heads. And if your strategy is take away all my bullets, right? How many bullets you've taken away from me is relevant to how I think about my strategy vis-a-vis you, at least to a certain extent. So China's
But if I look like I'm trying to, my point, I think that's my point. And that is, I think my point is, if we look like we're trying to take away all your bullets, that's going to make you very nervous.
That would be the
and
story of
edgy in a lot of ways.
But that would be the story of China and the United States right now, both ways. Because why is it that the US is edgy in part about restrictions on semiconductor manufacturing equipment? Because of a very clear, from the various highest levels of the Chinese government, assertion many years before the Biden administration ever imposed semiconductor manufacturing export controls, saying, we are going to end our dependence on the United States chip ecosystem. And a thoroughgoing line in Chinese policy saying, where we can find other forms of dependence, we are going to try to cut them out. So we have to react to that. And then, of course, they look at what we're doing on our side and do the same. So I didn't mean to take us down that hole, but I think the whole conversation's not complete without entering that.
What you said is completely fair. I think I am raising a legitimate, if out of the box issue, which is the right aspiration mutual non-dependence?
Right.
Or is the right aspiration some kind of managed balance?
And all I'm saying is two countries get a vote in that. And if one country is going for mutual balance and the other
is absolutely committed to going one way, then that is not a reasonable aspiration. If you take the dark scenarios in which the United States becomes involved, I think I'm using this word right, in a kinetic conflict with others. When people think about planning for that, obviously anything is possible. But I can imagine two broad kinds. I can imagine a kind that's a bit like World War II or Ukraine, where it goes on for several years, and what your industrial capacity is makes a big difference. And if you have more industrial capacity, then you're stronger and you're better and you're more likely to win. And the knowledge of that also helps to deter others. Or I could imagine that in the modern world, this type of conflict, whatever is going to happen, has happened in 10 days. And so having a lot of capacity to produce during the conflict really isn't very relevant to any important problem. It might be important to have a lot of inventory, but the conflict's going to be over before you can do a lot of production. What is thinking in the state-of-the-art national security community on how much it's the fast where the inventories are important versus slow where the production capacity and the ability to reorient your manufacturing is important?
First of all, you said state of the art. I'm glad you used the word art, because this is total art and not science, despite a massive planning mechanism in the Defense Department. The planning assumption of the US military is that if we got into a pure competitor war or near pure competitor war, China or Russia, that the other party would basically look at our inventory, time to exhaustion, and then time to replenishment to decide, not over the course of years, but over the course of weeks, whether they had escalation dominance or they could sustain it or we could. So the reason production capacity matters is not because you have to assume 3, 4, 5 years of war, but because any of these wars will involve a rapid run through your magazine depth and then proving to the other guy that you can replenish it. So the short answer is it's somewhere in between your two hypotheses. And it doesn't matter if there is no inventory. I mean, I just told you Ukraine is going to produce 1 million drones a month. There is no inventory really solution to what each side's going to throw at each other very, very fast. And the real question is going to be like, can I just outlast you? And unless you have some capacity to replace, the other side will say,
I think you're kind of confirming what was the suspicion I had behind the question. And it goes back to one of the first things we talked about. I think there's a reasonable argument to be made from what I know that because we had a lot of automobile production capacity, that really helped us win World War II, because we could turn that into capacity to produce tanks, and then we could turn other capacities into capacity to produce Liberty ships. And by the way,
this is Germany's going to end up having to turn its whole automobile production capacity into tank production, like today.
But the way you just described, it's weeks, and we're going to replenish, and do we have replenishment? Do we not have replenishment? That doesn't sound like a time scale where you're going to be reconverting a lot of factories, which tilts me towards the view that it's not some overall that whatever was true in World War II, in the context of today, it's, maybe we need to pay a lot of people to have drone factories.
Well, not automobile factories, but drones and robotics, right, basically. So what is going to be a lot of the basis of future manufacturing ought to be like almost kind of instantaneously convertible into producing relevant military equipment, I would think. I mean, this is all considering a war. Like if it started tomorrow, you might be right that it wouldn't be quite this way. But if we're actually imagining an evolution of our manufacturing ecosystem where, these two kind of basic components are central to warfighting, then that industrial capacity is going to be pretty relevant.
Right, but I don't know what the numbers exactly are. I would have thought that drones plus robotics, even on an ambitious view, wouldn't be more than 10 or 15% of US manufacturing. And so we might well be that we should be focused in a whole set of ways on drones and robotics, but the arguments that we need a strong manufacturing capacity because it helped us win World War II,
that comes back
feel more disconnected from the current
that comes
conflicts.
Back to the question of whether you need just an overall strong manufacturing base to have a strong base for these more specific sectors.
My last question, help me understand, because maybe Chris can say something at some point too. I'm just sort of all confused. We were saying that China couldn't buy various chips from NVIDIA, and China didn't like that because they wanted to have those chips because they thought they'd be good, and NVIDIA didn't like that because they wanted to have the money, and NVIDIA said that if we can't sell them, then we won't be able to have money, so we'll develop chips slower. And China and NVIDIA said, well, if you do this, maybe it'll be good for us in the short run, but in the long run, then they'll have their own chips, and then we won't be able to sell, and you won't be able to influence, so the whole thing's dumb. That's what NVIDIA said. So I understood both sides of the argument. But now that China has gone and said, we won't buy your damn chips anyway, NVIDIA, I'm just sort of confused. Am I misunderstanding what China's saying? Is China bluffing? Is China hurting itself? How should I just understand what it is that's going on?
I'd be interested in Chris's take and Jeff and Dan's take on this. I have a theory, but it could be totally wrong. I haven't talked to Chinese officials about this question since they've said this. My theory is China's doing two things. One, it's saying to its technology companies, get off your NVIDIA addiction because the future is coming and you're going to be on the Ascend stack, okay? And I think they're saying that so that all those companies' first purchase is of Ascends until they run out of Ascends, which is a pretty low ceiling this year, next year, and the following year. And then they'll let them fill in with NVIDIAs after that. That's what I think. I don't think they'll deny themselves the compute capacity if it's there. Then the second thing I think has more to do with negotiating gamesmanship. They would like to turn it into a give to the Trump administration that they will buy NVIDIA chips from an ask of the Trump administration that they can buy NVIDIA chips. And I think it might work, which is crazy. But those are my two theories, but I'd be interested in other people's takes.
Chris?
I think I agree with Jake's interpretation. I'd like if I can ask a question going back to the Cold War analogies we discussed. First, maybe an observation for Larry. It does seem important that that President Reagan had a theory of the Cold War too, which was we win, they lose, and that was a very different theory of the Cold War than you laid out, which I think is relevant in thinking about what actually ended the Cold War. Second, on escalation dynamics in the nuclear sphere, there's a very large literature on escalation dominance and the lack thereof, and I'd be interested to hear Jake reflect on what does that look like in the economic sphere.
Can I?
Please.
Let me answer first. So yeah, I get it completely about Star Wars, and Jake probably won't like this term, but I think it's fair to say that Jake is a creature of the blob, if there is such a thing as the blob, the kind of bipartisan foreign policy establishment.
To be honest, I think Bob, who's not here anymore, I don't think,
is a more
really
quintessential.
The blob.
He is a much more
He was trying to eject me from the blob.
He is a much more
heterodoxy on industrial policy.
Right, but you're probably not. You're probably not exit the blob in the direction of the people who are bringing you Star Wars.
A Golden Dome.
Yeah, you are the 1980 Star Wars. I'm saying yes. There are people who there is a theory of life, which is we were trying to win the Cold War. Star Wars was a tool for winning the Cold War. It was a good tool, and there are people who are thinking that should be our strategy vis-a-vis China today. I think I heard Jake rejecting that strategy, and I'm guessing that if Jake had been a player at that time rather than in junior high school or whatever he was, he would have been unenthusiastic about Star Wars as a strategy.
Well, I guess the question is, do you think Reagan was the prevailing planning assumption that the Soviet Union would collapse in 1985? I mean, because at the same time he's doing you win, we lose, he's doing arms control agreements, kind of bring down the temperature coexistence. So I can't tell how much of that was assertive as opposed to like the actual strategy. I don't know it deeply enough. I could see somebody basically taking my view of the US-China relationship and still say, we should win, they should lose, and believe everything else I said. I just personality-wise don't do that as much. But I feel like people sitting around the White House in '85 probably didn't think we're going to see the collapse of the Soviet Union sometime soon, but maybe they did think that.
Could I use you on escalation management and escalation dominance?
Oh, you're not going to answer that question? Okay, okay, fine, fair enough.
Can
the big challenge that I see here is about the relative pain thresholds of the two countries. And the basic intolerance of an American president for a sharp market disruption. And the greater capacity, I think, for the Chinese system to absorb a market disruption. And I think this creates huge escalation challenges for us if we get into these kind of tools of economic statecraft. And therefore, that is why I lean so hard on the resilience side to try to reduce exposure to that. But it also suggests that if the US is going to escalate, it can't be sort of a typical move up the ladder. It has to be really, really sharp to try to put an end to it. So you have to court a lot more risk because of the reality of the different pain thresholds. And that's a tough thing because then you got to hold on tight and really drop a huge hammer, whether it's a big financial sanction on major banks or something else. And that's hard for an American president because then the Secretary of the Treasury would be saying that's got its own massive risks associated with it. So that's how I see things. Yeah.
I'm going to make a more modest statement coming off of your question. I will have succeeded in what influence I hope to have in this panel if there is, if a year from now or 3 years from now, there's 20% as much thought and careful and rigorous disciplined thought as on questions related to escalation dominance in economic conflict as there was with respect to military conflict and counterforce postures and nuclear thresholds and all of that. And my frustration is that enthusiasm for what is kind of, I think it's fair to say, intellectually easier. And by the way, often the right thing to do in life is to do the easy thing. So I don't mean to denigrate it. But my view about this is enthusiasm for resilience policy, which I think may be a bit of a chimera, has led to lots of emphasis on saying we should be resilient and we should do this, that, and the other thing, and less careful and rigorous thought about the set of issues around escalation dominance, which I think may be necessary for managing this, because I think resilience, I think mutual resilience may be a very difficult place to safely get. And the things Jake said seem totally reasonable to me, and I don't have an alternative set of remarks to the ones he made to suggest that I think are better or wiser. But it just seems to me that a lot of thought about how the escalation takes place, how you respond, what's likely to be sustainable is very necessary. And I guess I would also just add for people's reflection, and Jake just touched on it in the last thing he said, the fact that they hold $1 trillion or so of pieces of paper that represent debt instruments of our country is highly relevant to these questions of escalation and economic conflict, whether that means they've got leverage because we owe them money, or we've got leverage because lots of their wealth is with us. I don't know how that set of tools connects with the other tools. There's another thing that I don't know, but I do think that the question of how these kinds of conflicts are likely to play out and how the things you do to promote resilience are going to be interpreted on the other side is, I think, a very important aspect of it. And I've said to some of you before, I was very struck just about a year ago. My wife and I spent a week in Tokyo, and the most striking hour of that week was visiting their World War II museum and seeing their version of Pearl Harbor. And their version of Pearl Harbor in the museum right there in the middle of Tokyo was a very different way of thinking about Pearl Harbor than the one to which I had become accustomed.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean we shouldn't stand up for our position, and all these things are symmetric, but it's an important aspect, I would submit, of the problem.
Just one small point on this. I think that rigorous analysis needs to be done. It requires sort of national security and geopolitical types, but it also requires economists not just to say, basically this is all bullshit. Like you need economists to come to the table and say, what are we trying to do here? We'll at least humor you, geopolitical and national security types, to work through that rigorously. And what I'm so just the way you engage this subject personally enriches the discussion massively for that reason. But I think we need the larger economics community, not just to start the conversation by saying you're all a bunch of idiots, which I think happens too frequently. So but by the way, I'm saying you are the opposite of that. But I think to get to that next 3 years,
an idiot.
No, saying that we're
and to be
idiots.
seen and to be
you do that too.
And to be seen as a patriot, seen as a patriot as well. No, I think I think what you're saying is entirely correct. There was a very good book written by Albert Hirschman about this soon after World War II. And he was a very distinguished economist, but I would say the field of international trade essentially paid no attention to any of the insights in his book for the subsequent 70 years. And I think that economics needs to take this very seriously is right. And I think that one of the comments I made earlier is important, which is I like to say the secret sauce of economics is arithmetic, and a little quantitation is helpful here. Yeah. And if the cost is 0.1%, we should get over ourselves on economic inefficiency. And if the cost is 8%, you should get over yourselves on resilience as a national imperative. And the truth is, and so it's important to be trying to figure out the answer. We're going to, with Chris's permission, we're going to allow a couple of questions if people have them.
I have sorry to just grab the mic. That was nice. I think we've been this is an awesome conversation, and I think we've are talking about two contingencies. One is a world of economic coercion, and you think through a mental model of what that looks like. Another is a world of war, and what that looks like. And I'd be curious for you to reflect on that. Should we be focused on one? Should we be focused on both? What are the implications of that?
It's a great question, and my base case is that we are going to live in a world of economic coercion, that is weaponized interdependence. That is going to be a feature not to scenario plan for, but we're living in it. It is happening today, and we need to deal with that. I think we need to scenario plan for the world of war. I think by and large, the prescriptions flow in the same direction, but the relative emphasis on the resilience piece is probably greater in the weaponized interdependence, and the weight of emphasis on manufacturing capacity in the United States is probably greater in preparing for the world of war. That's how I would think about it. But they're not at odds with one another. I do think they come to different points of emphasis.
Let's take these two questions.
Thank you. My name is Zihua, and I'm a first-year MPH student from Teach Chen School of Public Health. So my question is, assuming like we are living a perfect world, and you are going to meet Xi Jinping, like let's say in an hour, and he is going to ask you 3 wishes that you may have, and what would you ask him in order to fulfill U.S. industry and national security?
Okay.
Hi. My name is Dana Masalimova. I'm with the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies. I'm also an alum of the Kennedy School. I'm sorry, my question will be not about AI, not about China, but will be about Russia and Ukraine. The Trump administration has just announced its most serious sanctions. It's sanctioned Lukoil and Rosneft, including its 34 subsidiaries. Do you think, you just talked about economic interdependence, do you think economic coercion can lead to a negotiated ceasefire, or do you think it will lead to a military battlefield stalemate? Thank you.
So I will have to think about 3 wishes. I'll tell you my first wish would be don't invade Taiwan, because it would be cataclysmic for the world. So don't do it. Let's maintain peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait. Above and beyond anything else, there's no specific contingency, I think, that would be so calamitous as that. And then I think my second ask, and I'll leave it at just 2, is one of the big challenges I see between the US and China right now is that when it comes to big questions of arms control in the traditional sense, as China's doing a massive nuclear buildup right now, or AI risk for that matter, is that China is much more cautious about engaging the United States in a serious discussion of strategic stability than we are with them. I think largely because they think it's a trap of some kind. And I would say we're in a serious competition. We have to manage that competition, get in the game in these conversations the way we did them, frankly, with the Soviets. Not that the Cold War analogy should be directly ported. And I would ask him to empower his people to really engage on those questions in a way that they just don't do right now. And I think it's to our mutual detriment. And then I hadn't obviously seen that news. I've been advocating for steps along these lines. Do I think it's a magic bullet to end the war? I don't. Do I think that it will put material pressure on Putin and the Russian economy in a way that is necessary to increase the likelihood that we get to a negotiated outcome? I do. I think that would be a good step.
Thank you.
I think we're going to stop there. I want to thank Chris Miller, who organized this conference. I want to thank all the people who spoke and all the people who helped organize all this. I feel like I've learned a lot. I hope others have as well. And I hope that this is an area where there are at least as many questions as there are settled answers. And I hope the dialogues will go on. Thank you very much, everybody.
And just to add to that, just for one moment, our